Good morning and welcome to this week's Stories of Music. Thanks for joining us. This week we're starting a series on the history of Canadian rock and roll. This is part 1, In the Beginning, the 1940s and 50s. Rock as a sound really has its source in the late 40s amalgamation of country music, gospel music, and rhythm and blues. Although you could hear elements of rock and roll as far back as the Canadian country songs of the 1930s and 40s, and even further back, the American blues songs of the 1920s. The forerunners of rock were really the rhythm and blues and electric or Chicago blues that were first heard on American radio in the late 40s and would have been picked up by Canadian listeners lucky enough to be close to the border. In 1951, a DJ by the name of Alan Freed in Cleveland, Ohio, started to play rhythm and blues music to a wider audience. He termed rock and roll as the doo-wop and rockabilly singers that were the pop music of the time. The Four Lads, which was a group out of Toronto, had a hit in 1952 with their song The Mockingbird, and they were one of the first to capitalize on this new sound. Other Canadian artists, such as the Crew Cuts and Diamonds, continued to define the version of rhythm and blues that was more often starting to become known as rock and roll. In 1957, Canadian Paul Anka recorded the song Diana. The following year, 1958, he went to New York City to audition it for ABC Records. It was an immediate hit, and it turned Paul Anka into the first Canadian teen idol rock star of the time. Diana would go on to be the first #1 hit from a Canadian on the Billboard charts in the rock and roll era. It also was one of the best-selling 45s of all time. Also in 1958, an Arkansas-born singer by the name of Ronnie Hawkins moved to Canada. He became one of the first artists to really promote Canadian rock stars. He formed a backing band called the Hawks, and it was composed of what would be some of the first Canadian-born rock stars. Now, next week, when we talk about the 1960s, we'll find out what happened to the members of the Hawks. You won't want to miss that. Thanks for joining us for this week for the early history look at Canadian rock music. We'll see you next week where we continue with the 1960s. Bye for now.